This is the We Witches 3 podcast, where you will hear the opinion of 3 seasoned witches who are tired of glossy, tunnel vision, love and light accolades about serious metaphysical topics. Your hosts, Charlene, Maria Sewell, and Heather Woodworth have been practicing witches and professional psychics for over 20 years. They not only have the experience, but they have the research to back it up. So get comfortable on your brooms, grab a snack, and get ready for a wild ride.
Welcome, everybody, to our podcast today. This is Nathara, and I'm talking to Mat Auryn, and he just came out with he's coming out with a new book, Psychic Witch, which is a fantastic book that kind of goes over energy work aimed at the witch community. Is that what you would say it's about, Matt?
Yeah. A lot of it was because I see witchcraft and psychic ability kind of compartmentalized and separated. So I wanted to show that they're not as separate as people are making them. That
is a great way to start off, because one of the things that really struck me as I was reading your book is that there's kind of like 3 different parts of the community, and I've settled into a part of the community that really sees like the psychic part of existence and witchery is just kind of the same thing. You know, our community is like fully integrated, but I remember growing up that like psychics and witches were wholly segregated.
Right.
And that really is still a true thing, especially when you're talking about real life events rather than the internet.
Right, exactly.
So you have shops and stuff that are going to be very witch focused or very psychic focused, but they don't really overlap so much. And I was wondering if you would be willing to share some of those insights that you're seeing out there, because I don't see that so much in real life anymore.
I think a lot of it has to deal with sort of people's opinions on the two. So you have the like kind of more new age spiritual psychic community that has this kind of perception of witchcraft as either something kind of darker or something that's a bit more outdated in their point of view, you know, because there's a focus on the new age and like new energies and not doing things necessarily by the book or by structure. And then you have the witchcraft community. So a big trend in witchcraft that I've seen over the years is this kind of lack of focus on the psychic ability, on the energy perception, and it's getting a little bit more fixated on the items and the tools and the procedures and stuff. And while it is possible to do magic, of course, without that kind of psychic focus and that psychic perception, it's really empowered vastly by that kind of psychic awareness and that conscious energy perception and manipulation.
I remember seeing that too when I was younger. And I've mentioned before that like I grew up with a mother who was Rosicrucian, which is very much on the metaphysician/psychic side of the community. And like you said, I remember like witchcraft was like, oh, that's dark, we don't go there. In my brain, it's very like an 80s, 90s kind of thing that has gone away, but actually it's still very much around today. And conversely, the witchcraft community kind of looks sometimes at the psychic side of things like that's very foo-foo.
Right.
It's all very like woo-woo. Like, how do you even know that you're doing anything?
Right, exactly. And I've been immersed in both communities at different times in my life. And, you know, as much as, you know, witchcraft wants to like look down at the more new age communities, there is something to it. There is something to that energy work. You know, especially if you go back to its roots, like you were talking about, like the Rosicrucians. If you go back further, you have like Theosophy and you have like the occult revival. And as much as people want to kind of say that it doesn't, both witchcraft and the New Age kind of stem from that, from Theosophy, and then later like the spiritualism movement in America and such. So it just seems sort of like the Dark Crystal almost, right? So it's like this one thing that has kind of been split into its 2 different focuses. You know, the spiritual community is very focused on, you know, positivity and love and light and things of that nature. And the witchcraft community tends to want to look at the darker things, the wilder things, the more natural things, the things here on Earth, as opposed to like the astral, celestial type things. And really, it's kind of like two missing pieces, like I was saying. So even, like right now, what's in vogue in both communities is this idea of shadow work. And what's really interesting is that I see a lot in both communities that they both have kind of half of the coin of this original concept that came from Carl Jung. So, there's this idea of, yes, needing to look at those dark aspects of ourselves, or those aspects of ourselves that we've just rejected or don't want to be part of our persona. And the ultimate goal is to bring those to light, to ally with that, to bring it forward in our consciousness. So I see a lot of trends with witchcraft where they're talking about shadow work and stuff, but then they're looking down on this idea of like spiritual people, working with love and light and stuff. And the whole purpose of the Jungian integration of the shadow is to get to that point of light, and not just stay stuck in that unconscious darkness.
And it's so interesting to hear that because, I remember working in shadow work with my mother when I was younger, and then it just kind of continued on as I delved more and more into the witchcraft community. Like, it's just been a constant. Especially when you look at the internet community, you see everyone's just doing the same thing.
All right.
And I think especially when you look at the internet, you can see that the fads and trends in the community hit both communities at the same time. Like, everyone suddenly gets into crystals again. Everyone suddenly gets into tea leaves at the same time. Palmistry hits everyone at the same time. Everyone gets into shadow work at the same time. Suddenly everyone's into moon cycles at the same time. And it just hits both communities at the exact same time.
Right.
And so it is so weird to have this division. And like I said, I mostly have been interacting with the online community more than the real life community. So I tend to forget that there's this weird schism between the two. And so reading your book really reminded me that there are so many witches that I talk to who have no idea how the psychic senses work. And what I really loved was when I was reading your book, so many of the ideas and thoughts and concepts that you went over were things that I remember first reading about when I was like 6 and 7 and 8 years old. There's an exercise where you teach grounding in one part, and then you talk about the terrestrial energy and then the celestial energy with the tree exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of my favorite exercises that I've been doing since I was like 6. And like, here it was in your book, but you explained it in such a beautiful way.
Thank you.
Because the books that I read them in had them separately. And it wasn't until like I had gotten older that I put them all together as one exercise. But there they were in your book as one, like, we're just going to put them all together. And so that was really beautiful. I was like, wow, this is stuff that I had growing up in like 5 or 6 different books that you've put together nicely, all in one place that grows and builds organically, one on top of the other. Also, I can't believe that so many witches are running around out there not knowing this stuff.
Right. Well, the psychic component, as I was saying, I feel in the larger community has, I don't want to say been lost, but it's not a focus anymore. If you go to like the older books, so particularly like for me, like what I feel is the main ancestor of my book is Laurie Cabot's Power of the Witch, where she really unites like that psychic ability and that witchcraft. But if you go back even further than that, to like the 60s and the 70s, there was a much stronger focus on like the psychic power behind witchcraft. And if you go back even further to like, the Victorian occultists like Dion Fortune and even Aleister Crowley and all of them, there is this huge focus on the power of the mind. They're defining magic by discussing consciousness. They're talking about the power of imagination and the faculties of the mind. And it's become in witchcraft, there's been this trend of, talking about role-playing witches. And it's funny because, like, I'm not a role player myself, but I've known role players. And, like, I think if they're saying that, they're kind of missing the point, because all the role players I've met when they're role playing, they are so immersed into it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, they've just totally like become the thing, and their imagination is so active. And as I discuss in my book, you know, imagination is the alpha brainwave state. That's where we daydream, that's where we imagine, but that's also where psychic ability is.
The difference between, you know, imagination and visualization is fuzzy at best.
Yes, because with psychic ability, I mean, other than certain clairs like clairtangency and stuff, it's using a database of what you know, and how it communicates to you feels like imagination. And that's why, you know, I've had many people that I've trained in workshops, and different students of mine, you know, ask, well, how do I know it's not just my imagination? How do I know that I'm not just making this up? And my answer is always, if it's just your imagination, you're on the right track. It doesn't mean it's accurate or it's true, but it means you're getting there. You're starting to tap into that faculty that we are taught as a modern society to totally look down on and dismiss.
I love how you talked about using it assertively, like you discuss reading auras in the book, and you talk about how like you're going to project a color onto this aura.
Right.
Like just pick one.
Yeah.
You know, and that's going to teach your brain that you can have colors in an aura. And then after a while, it's going to start being like, no, this is the right color.
Exactly. That's what I was just about to say, but I think I say that in the book, that, you know, often, you know, the process will start correcting itself.
Because we do have that fear of being wrong, and it kind of just gives you permission, like, yeah, be wrong. That's fine. Like, you have to start somewhere.
Exactly. And that's why my first exercise is literally role playing, you know, because it allows you to be wrong. It allows you not to have that pressure and that kind of self-sabotage that most people come up against when trying to tap into their psychic abilities.
And I think, you know, especially that kind of concern coming from people in the witchcraft community is really interesting, because we have the same issue when you're doing spells or, you know, potions or whatever. Like, how do you know that any of it is working?
Right.
You know, you just kind of have to have some faith and belief in it, and you have to have some kind of trust and go with it, and then the results will follow.
Right. Well, and I think that's why, you know, learning psychic ability is so crucial for witchcraft, because you can start sensing when something is charged, or, you know, when your spell is working. Like I was talking about in my book, a common phenomenon for me when I cast a circle is I start getting a ringing in my ears, sort of like tinnitus, but a little bit different until the circle's released. So I can often kind of clairaudiently perceive if a circle has been cast correctly or not.
Yes, and one thing that you had, and just like as a complete aside, one thing that you had discussed in the book that was really exciting to me is you had discussed clairaudience. Mm-hmm. I've looked into this for years and years because I always have had this issue where when things are really, really quiet, I can kind of hear like what sounds like a radio signal, but like the volume's really, really low. So I can't really hear what people are saying, but I can hear kind of a conversation happening.
Right.
And you describe that as a part of clairaudience in the book. And I have like literally looked all over the place in books and the internet and stuff my entire life and never heard anyone else describe it that way.
Yeah. So I believe that that's kind of like, not intentionally, but it's sort of like eavesdropping. So it's sort of like if you were at a restaurant and you can kind of hear what people at the next table are saying, but you can't quite make out what they're saying, you know, as opposed to them speaking to you directly. So when I hear spirits speaking to each other and stuff of that nature, it tends to feel a little distant, as you were saying, and a little bit kind of out of focus. But I tend to kind of almost hear like a water type noise with it as well.
Yeah, sometimes I'll get like a white noise, like when you have a TV on a snow channel. I don't know if young people are going to understand what I just said at all. When you have it like on that fuzzy snow channel, like on Poltergeist the movie, sometimes there will be that sound like in the background of the conversation as well. Like it's not quite tuned in all the way.
Yeah.
And my mother would say that. She would say that you're hearing, the voices of the spirits and stuff, but I was never able to confirm that.
Right. So, and I believe that, like, when it is out of focus and distance like that, like, I feel if you're able to kind of hear that they're not speaking directly to you. Because when they speak directly to you, like, you know it. And that was one of the things I wanted to address in my book, because I've known so many psychics as a professional psychic. I obviously have a lot of peers that I come in contact with. I've had a lot of witches that I come across both in my traditional training and just friendship. And one of the things that I see over and over in books and by teachers is they talk about how you will never hear an external voice speak to you. That if you do, it's some kind of mental illness and you need to get checked. And I absolutely disagree with that 1,000%, based on my experience and the experiences of others.
It's so weird because I think I'm probably a bit older than you, since you made a reference to Mighty Morphin Power Rangers.
Yes.
Because the books that I read they were like my mother's. I read like, Shakti Gawain and stuff like that for my psychic references growing up, which are all books that came out like in the 70s and very early 80s. That was not information that was ever in those. They never were like, voices are never going to be heard externally. They were like internal, external, whatever. Their voices, as long as they're not telling you to hurt yourself, you have nothing to worry about.
That's fantastic, because that's not the attitude I see in more modern books and modern teachings.
Yeah, and there has definitely been a shift in the community, like over time, because I definitely have seen what you're talking about in more recent books.
Right.
Where they're like, no, it's always going to be your voice in your head, like the narrator you hear when you read a book, and that's the only way you're going to hear a psychic voice.
Right.
And that is so untrue.
Right. It's a way, but it's sort of, as you touched upon and I talk about in my book, is I feel almost all of the Claires they have an internal version and an external version.
Now, I have to say, too, you explained the Claires so well. In fact, the whole book is really just very well written. Everything is broken down very clearly. It's a really great explanation, and you build on each piece really, really organically. Like, I have to say, I was really, really impressed with it. Even if, like, this is somebody's first book and the only book they were going to get, I would say to go for it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Absolutely, because like I said, I had so many books when I was younger to work off of, and all those like essential exercises that I learned from them are in this book.
Yeah, and that was, I don't remember who, but one of my endorsements called it a masterclass in psychic ability and magic. And that was sort of my intention, drawing off things that I've learned like throughout my whole spiritual journey since I was a child, and thinking about, well, what is the book that I would have loved as a child? And that was sort of the main direction for writing this book.
And that was really interesting, too, because you do cover shielding and protection in here as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a good chuckle because when I turned to that chapter, it's kind of later in the book. And
right.
Usually when you start a psychic class, it's one of the first things they teach you, right? They teach you ground, center, shield, right, like right out the gate. And the shielding section actually comes kind of later in the book, although you address it first thing in the chapter.
Yes.
About why you're bringing it so late. And like when I read that, I had never considered your reasoning for doing that. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, fair point. That's a completely valid reason, and I thought it would be great if you talked about that because your reasoning is just perfect.
So I hope I don't sound like a snob saying it.
We do. We sound like snobs. That's what we do on this.
Okay. Well, like my reasoning is because you want it to work, and you have to understand, because it's not just visualizing shielding. It's not just intent. It's about learning how to empower that process and make it actually work. And a lot of the stuff building up to it there's not really any huge reason to shield. I mean, starting the kind of basic openings and stuff that I guide the person through, grounding should take care of, I would say, 90% of all of that. But to actually shield and, because it's more than just imagining like a bubble around you, right? Because my whole direction in the book is discussing how, there's a difference between just visualizing something and then like empowering that visualization.
So it's more about not just like envisioning the, bubble of energy around you, but also knowing that it's there.
Right. And putting the energy behind it, the willpower behind it.
Yeah, like you have to actually be able to affect energy before you can actually make a shield.
Exactly.
And not just hoping for the best.
Right.
Which, when I read that in the book, I thought like, oh yeah, that completely makes sense. Because otherwise, you run into a situation where someone's trying to shield, but maybe they don't have any muscles to work with energy, and they're just like, this isn't working, I'm drowning.
Right. Or, the other thing that I found with a lot of people is, when it's taught at the very beginning, which is why, so much of the book is very fundamental, is very basic, but my idea was to go deep with the basics because people rush through them. And when shielding is taught so quickly right off the bat, people don't really take the time to develop it. So they just assume that they know how to do it. And then later down the line, they start running into problems because they aren't effectively shielding, because they view it as something that was, taught in class 1, and doesn't need that much work or attention.
Oh, yeah, so they're doing kind of a slapdash job.
Exactly. And if you look at like a lot of the book, a lot of the practices from, I would say at least like half of the book, like if you were to zoom out, like those tend to be taught very quickly. They're very rushed basics. And I think that that's sort of setting people up for failure because that foundation needs to be solid. I wanted to find the depth in it and really have people revisit it and, give it the attention that these things deserve because we're so eager to rush on to, the exciting stuff.
You just reminded me of, what is it, that Bruce Lee quote? Better a man who has practiced a kick 10,000 times than a man who's practiced 10,000 kicks one time.
Exactly. That's beautifully put.
Well, it wasn't me, it was Bruce Lee.
Yeah, it's still beautifully put.
But yeah, and so you just reminded me again, like how lucky I was to learn all these basics when I was, 6 and 7 and 8, from a teacher who taught me instead of just like being handed a book and like, go off, learn the things.
Right.
Because yeah, you're right. Like taking your time and like spending a week on just grounding, like you're going to learn this 2, 3, 5, 6 times a day before moving on to the next step is really important, because if you don't take your time on that stuff, you do end up with this rickety foundation.
Right. One of the exercises, which I actually had other authors be like, oh man, I'm trying to get past this exercise. One of the early ones is where I'm like, count to 100. I don't remember if it's count up or count down because I teach it differently in person, but it's like, without being distracted, and it's way harder than people think, but it's so crucial to get that kind of focus and that, that discipline down before you start rushing off to the fun and the exciting things.
Absolutely. Without falling asleep.
Right. Without falling asleep.
Yeah, that's always my issue when I start up my meditation practice again. I always end up falling asleep within about a minute. I'm always like, dang.
Or, just the mind wandering, like that monkey mind.
Yeah, absolutely. If my mind wanders, I can stay awake. And if I keep it focused, I fall asleep. And that's always like, so after I finished reading the book, I was like, okay, I need to start up my meditation practice again. This is sloppy. It's sloppy again. So I've started that up again.
Yay.
So thank you for that. But yeah, it was really great. So about, I'd say, and I'm estimating this because I actually read your book electronically, so I have it on my Kindle. About 60% of the way through the book, I was like, okay, this feels like a psychic book aimed at witches. Like there's not actually going to be any witchery in it. Mm-hmm. But at about that point, you actually started introducing more exercises that included what I would consider more like witchcraft.
Yes.
So that's where you started introducing things like casting circles and using candle work and that kind of stuff for spells and whatnot. And so I wanted to point that out, that it isn't all just in quotes, just psychic work. So there is stuff in here that is actual witchery, I guess. That fuzzy line between psychic stuff and witchery.
Absolutely.
So if people are concerned, I do want to say that it's in there.
So one of the things that I was touching on earlier is this. I feel like it's a trap where people start relying on their objects and their tools and, all the things that are fun and sensual about witchcraft, like the candles and the herbs and, the athame and the wand. And while those are great, they really don't do a whole lot on their own. I always imagine, so if you were stranded in a desert with nothing, how would you magic yourself out of the desert? Okay,
well, I used to live in Arizona, so deserts are very resourceful.
But we don't need all of these things. Like our ancestors didn't have all of these things.
No.
And their magic still works because the magic, as the Victorian occultists like Crowley and Dion Fortune talk about, it's a consciousness. It's more about, your consciousness being directed by will and empowering and uniting with those physical objects. So to get to that point, I feel it is important to talk about the psychic ability, in depth, before moving on to the magic, to the witch part, the witchcraft. I think the most tools I have or ingredients in the book are tea lights, for a thing or two. The rest
you use candles, and there's ice cubes.
And ice cubes, yes. And a wine glass for one of them. Mm-hmm. But, I do. There is value and power and energy in the physical things, in the herbs, in the stones, in the tools. But if we want to get the most out of everything, we're going to need to use our psychic faculties to really tap into those objects and to empower them and to make this whole thing a very palpable, conscious, magical experience. There is a focus on the non-traditional witchy things. I obviously work traditional spells in my own magical practice in my daily life, but I think it's important to try to not get lost and hung up on the external before mastering the internal and how to relate to the external.
The most important ingredient in any spell is the witch themselves.
Exactly.
And the rest is just gravy.
Yeah.
Not to say that it's useless, it
Absolutely
can add
not.
to the experience, but it's not essential for the experience.
Exactly.
And I really like how you talk later in the book about a way to substitute ingredients by appealing to the spirit of the ingredient.
Yeah.
Instead, I thought that was fantastic.
Thank you.
Because I always have to substitute things.
Right. I think that's a very common witch problem.
Yeah, I refuse to keep a fully stocked. I mean, I know I've seen some beautiful cabinets and closets that other witches have, but I don't have that kind of space or attention to detail, to be frank. They just have these beautiful closets with all these beautiful vials and boxes and categorization, and I just don't have that much energy, and so I'm constantly substituting things where I'm like, okay, well, I have 2 out of the 7 things that I need, and I'm just gonna do that. That's fine. And so I thought this was a great way of substituting the elements. Usually I'm just like, okay, and if any land spirits are around who want to pitch in and pick up the slack, that'd be great. You know? But that's a great substitution that I think I'm going to work. And that's basically just asking, like, the element of spearmint to jump in. And I don't actually have spearmint, so if you could jump in, that would be great.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's easy and simple. Like, that's a great way to do it. Because energy is energy. It doesn't know any time or place. So there's no need to be constrained by all this physics stuff.
Absolutely. So one of the things I talk about in my reality map that I explore throughout the book for the purposes of the book is, if you think about it, like, the physical level is only one of 7 levels that you're working on when you're doing magic. So, having mandrake root is, can be very, very powerful in a spell, but, that mandrake exists on more than just the physical level.
And so you can call it in from the other levels.
Right. Yep.
In those later chapters, I'm flipping through the book now, but you do talk about I forget what you call it, like the multi-dimensional, the other 6 realms that we kind of exist on as well. And that isn't something that I've even read about for decades now.
Okay.
That is some old information that we're going back to. And I have to say, it was really refreshing to read.
Thank you.
This is information I haven't really accessed. I do a lot of stuff based on this information. Like you just heard me refer, like, there's no time or space that I need to be concerned about because of all these different levels. But knowing that there are these different levels to yourself and that you exist in all these different kind of etheric forms, and there's these different bodies that you can access, really adds different dimensions to your magical or psychic practice.
Absolutely. And I think that's, one of those areas where, witchcraft and then the New Age spiritual movement have, like, a piece of it. They have, like, a half of each thing. Those multi-dimensional aspects of ourselves, those energy bodies, exist on the plane of that energy. So when we're casting magic, when we're working magic, the goal is to move it through all of those layers of reality and then have it come back to us like a boomerang. So by being conscious of those levels of reality and those levels of ourselves, our manifestation becomes so much more powerful.
Absolutely incredible, especially breaking it down into the individual steps the way that you did. I don't think I've ever seen it quite as explicit as that, which is really, really nice.
Oh, thank you.
No, thank you. How many exercises are in the book? Do you know?
Oh my God. It's a little under 100.
Like, getting to the end of the book, it doesn't feel old. Like, you don't get to the end of the book thinking, like, oh my God, not another exercise. Like, what is he making me do now?
Good.
Like, there's none of that kind of feeling. The exercises are all very relevant, and they feel really pertinent to what we're doing. They don't feel like you're putting exercises in for the sake of doing exercises. But there are a lot of exercises.
Right. There's 93.
93 exercises. Yeah, which is really fantastic because this stuff really needs doing. It's not just enough to explain it, but it really matters to actually do it and work with it. And it's not a book that I think would be great to read all in one sitting.
No, absolutely not. It'd be difficult to do. And you wouldn't get the fullness of it anyways, because half of it is experiencing those exercises. So experiencing the different clairs, experiencing the different souls, the different energy bodies, and then just slowly, everything builds on itself, which I think you talked about, to where at the end it's just purely what I call psychic magic. It's extrasensory sorcery, where there's a whole chapter devoted to doing magic without anything.
To me, that's the good stuff right there. Like, if you really needed to, you could just do your magic in bed.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of the magic that I do, I would say about 70% of the magic I do is not even in my body. I do it while astral projecting, but that's a whole another topic, perhaps for another book. But I don't think it really matters, what plane of reality you're in, as long as each one is somehow touched on.
as far as that goes, this really makes witchcraft a lot more accessible for people who have disabilities, because it can be really difficult to, walk the pace of the circle that's 20 by 20 if you have mobility issues.
Right.
Or to handle certain witchcraft tools if you're missing hands or things like that. And being able to work magic that can exist purely in your mind really opens up magic for everyone.
Absolutely. And that's one of the, the weird, going back to the differences between the spiritual communities of witchcraft and kind of the more New Age psychic. A lot of the New Age psychic is focused on using these psychic abilities and this energy work for healing and for bettering themselves and just different. It's really focused on healing, and that same energy can be used to manifest things, to enhance your own personal life, not just you on a spiritual, psychological level, or even a physical healing, but literally pay the bills,
Yes.
know?
And it's so easy if you're in the psychic community and you're looking at manifestation, you fall right into the whole law of attraction community, which is its own special place.
Yeah.
I'm going with place right now.
I'm very mixed about the law of attraction community and the whole idea of it. I do believe in the power of positive thinking and manifestation and attraction. I just think it's not being taught correctly because it's more complicated than just feeling good about something and attracting it.
Well, you're familiar with the Theosophists and their teachings, so you kind of are already familiar with where the whole law of attraction mindset came from. So yeah. I'm sure you can see all the gaps in what they're doing.
Exactly. And even Hermetics, I mean, yes, attraction is a part of, Hermetic ideology, like the Kybalion and stuff, but it's only one principle of 7.
So the law of attraction, they mean well, but there's some stuff missing.
And it can work. I mean, just as I talk about in the book, you can get your magic to work without perceiving it. It's just when you can perceive it, you're not going in blind, or what Ivo Dominguez Jr. Refers to, and I talk about in the book, I reference it, a noir perception, which I think is brilliant, being the noir being the opposite of clair in French, so being dark instead of clear.
It was some fantasy book I read. I love fantasy, where a bunch of psychics ran into a bunch of witches, and the witches were like, how can they do what they do without tools? And the psychics were like, how can they do what they do without seeing?
I love that. Yeah, that's perfect, because that's pretty much, that's my book.
Yeah. And I was like, well, yeah, I forget that there's still that schism in the community. And it's so weird. So yeah, it's a fantastic book. All the great exercises I remember doing, and I still do, are in here, and it's really fantastic. But I want to talk about some of the other things that you're doing as well, because you're a crazy prolific writer. I think every 2 days you're writing a new article on something in the community.
Not as often as I used to, but because book writing is now taking a chunk of my time. I write a lot of articles.
Well, so you have a column on Patheos.
So I have a column, a blog on Patheos called For Puck's Sake, which is, a pun on For Fuck's Sake. And it just started off originally as me, as a place to vent, as a place to be because the witchcraft community gets really riled up about something and really how would I put it? Focus on a certain idea. And so this was my place to vent against it. So for example, there are trends even within polytheism, where all of a sudden everyone's oh, the gods are, these absolute concrete separate beings, and they never, relate to one another. They're not the same. They're not connected. And then another era of witchcraft comes by, and then, the gods aren't separate at all. They're all the same thing. So it started as my place to kind of explore the boxes that we kind of put ourselves in with our thinking. And then it just kind of evolved into me reviewing books and interviewing the people that I wanted to talk to. And a lot of that had to deal with reading online articles with authors and teachers that I love, and then feeling like the questions they were asked were just so bad. Like they were unfamiliar with the person and they didn't read their books. So it started as a place where I was like, well, I want to ask, this teacher questions. And it just kind of has evolved into a place where now, it's about exploring ideas, teaching things, book reviews, interviews. I do a lot of book reviews because I do read a lot, but I only review books that I enjoy, that I think will be helpful to other people in the community, because I'm not into tearing people down for their work. If I didn't enjoy a book or I didn't feel it was helpful to me, especially now that I've written a book, I see how much goes into it. I rather have people focus on the good work that people are doing and not talk bad about people. I think it's just kind of a personality thing too. I just don't enjoy tearing people down.
And what you might think is unhelpful might be super helpful to someone else.
Exactly. But, I'm not going to, be like, oh, well, I didn't like this book, or whatever. It's not my place
right.
to even discuss it. Why even bring attention to it if I don't find it helpful or good?
Right. I know in my own book reviews, there have been times where I have found things that could irritate other people in books. Mm-hmm. And I mention those, like, I'll be like, these are the really great things about this book. However, if you have an issue with X, Y, and Z, you might want to find something else.
Right. And I think that's good as well. I just try to focus on my favorites. So there's a lot of books that I read that never end up getting reviewed because of that.
That's definitely a fair way to go. Yeah. Especially since, like I said, other people might find something helpful about a book. I've never run across a book that I found that was like completely problematic. Like it should not be on the shelves.
Yeah.
Okay, you have. That's fine. We can go without saying more. I have been enjoying your articles.
Thank you.
I especially like one that I had specifically brought up was the one you had written on The Craft. I watched The Craft. I'm a Witch Now.
Oh yes, the movie The Craft.
Yeah, that was a favorite of mine. And like I said, there's a slight difference in age here because it was my senior year of high school.
Oh yeah, I was a child. So I just recently met Rachel True, who plays Rochelle. Yeah. So I booked a tarot appointment with her in October because she was like guest reading for a little bit in Salem. So I was like, fuck yeah. Like, I booked it like months in advance and I got to meet her and like, it was, I fangirled so hard, but tried to play it cool. Like, I brought her like a whole big thing of gifts and, when we got to the tarot reading, she's like, oh, what do you want to know? I'm like, oh, I don't care. I just want to meet you. But her reading was actually very, very spot on. I was impressed, and I tend to have kind of a high bar when it comes to psychic readings and tarot readings.
Yeah, I've heard really amazing things about her readings.
Yeah.
So she's incredible. Yeah, very jealous right now.
I would be jealous of me too. It was literally like I fangirled. Oh my god.
Yeah, so that's one of the movies that outed me in high school. Like,
how so?
Well, all my friends were kind of like, well, if they do that and they're witches and you also do all that, does that mean you're also a witch? And I was like, yeah, got me.
Right.
Because by then it was just kind of like, hey guys, like these are the things that I do. Don't worry, I'm just kind of weird.
Yeah, one of the things that like, Rachel was like, oh my god, that's so good to hear. I never hear that. Is I was talking about like, yes, it's a fictional movie and there's so many witches that complain about it. But for a fictional movie, I mean, it's not that far off. I mean, yes, you're not going to walk on water. You're not going to, you know what I mean? Like, change your hair color. But, you know, like, Feruza at the time was studying the occult. To my knowledge, all of them have been interested in the occult, aside from Robin, who played boring-ass Sarah.
The hero that no one likes, yeah?
Yeah, and they had some lady, Pat, I can't think of the name, who is with Covenant of the Goddess, who was, like, their consultant throughout the whole movie to make it, like, realistic.
Oh, yeah, I know the stuff that happened in the movie was very similar to what was very popular in the books from the Welland at the time, which was very Wicca-focused.
Right.
In the 90s. So the like spells and rituals and beliefs were very similar, just like the names were changed.
Right. So even like the deity is like a made up deity.
Yeah, Menno or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because the way they talk about him is very like Baphomet or very star goddess. You know, he is the sun and the football fields and all this stuff. But what's interesting is Christopher Penczak, I think, is the one who pointed this out to me. There's a strong possibility that it's Manon McLear, the Irish sea god.
I've wondered myself.
Yeah, like sea and storm, because when you start looking at the things that he does, it's very much like that, you know. And she's like, "Oh, these dead sharks are my gifts."
And the name is really similar too, so it's not like a huge leap to make.
Right.
But yeah, I love your take on that whole, you know, the whole pretend witch kind of thing that was going around, especially the last couple of years. And just how kind of open and welcoming you are, like, because that, I don't know if you've seen that, we've done episodes on the whole, like, pop culture witchcraft thing as well. You know, with everything coming out in the media and how it feels like the old school witches are very like, you know, get that pop media out of here. We don't want new recruits. And it's
get off my lawn.
Yeah, very old man yells at clouds. And so like seeing you talk about how like that was integral to your experience as well to bring you into the witchcraft fold was really nice. Like there's a real understanding in your writing about how the old traditions actually really work with the new world as opposed to trying to keep it this ancient thing.
Well, even then, like if you really honestly look at witchcraft, so if you look at like Gerald Gardner, for example, he was drawing off a lot of folklore, a lot of, you know, mythology and a lot of ideas of what the witch was. So if you think about it in the context of like what was media and mass consumption about witches at the time, it's almost like, you know, a parallel. You know, he's drawing off like Robert Graves and, you know, this whole folkloric witchcraft revival. It's just that this is the new form of storytelling and entertainment. And I think that they influence each other. I don't think that they're completely as separate as people think. I've come to think of witchcraft as its own conscious spirit, and I think it knows what it does, including in pop culture.
I love that. I kind of look at like religion as a topic that way. Mm-hmm. Like religion is its own entity that does what it does, and so seeing witchcraft that way too makes perfect sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you know, it's part of like, you know, like witchcraft goes through its current waves. It did it in the 90s, it's doing it now, where it becomes like sexy and cool and mysterious and dark. And I see that very much as like the spirit of witchcraft's glamour, to lure people in, to draw them in, and not everyone's going to stay, and not everyone's going to get past that, you know, aesthetic level of magic and the craft. But I think it's one of the ways that the spirit of witchcraft survives and evolves and brings new blood, so to speak, into it.
Yeah, because some people are going to stay.
Exactly.
Or some of their friends are going to stay as a, you know, side effect of them getting into it from whatever they got into it from.
Right, and that was my main point, to go full circle about why I wrote that article about the craft. Because like that is one of the most mocked, oh, you watch The Craft, so you think you're a witch. It's like, yes, I watched The Craft as a child, and it was like a religious experience. It was like finding a whole different world that I didn't know existed, and it started a whole thirst for me.
And I think that's such a great point to make and to see out there too, because like how else are you going to know about witchcraft, right? Like otherwise it's just like a Hansel and Gretel thing.
Right.
Otherwise people will be like, well, I guess it's Catholicism or nothing.
Exactly. And that was like, I didn't even, before I saw that movie, because it was portrayed in a semi-realistic way, it had never crossed my mind that people could do things like that.
Well, exactly, because otherwise you don't know it's even an option.
Exactly.
And that's your pop media and that kind of thing. That's really how we get exposed to a lot of ideas. And then you see something in TV or media and you think like, hey, that sounds interesting. I'm going to go Google it, I guess.
Right.
You're not going to go look it up in the library anymore. But now we're going to Google it and see what's really out there. And then you can discover this whole treasure trove of things.
Yeah. And like, it also works the other way too. So like going back to Gerald Gardner, for example, like the first book he wrote about witchcraft was fiction. Mm-hmm. There's a long-standing tradition of occultists writing fiction because there's some things that can only be taught through storytelling. It's, for example, the never-ending story. The never-ending story is seen as just, like a fantasy story, but the author, Michael Ende, was a Thelemite. He was an occultist. The whole book is a parable about occultism and Thelemic teachings that are easier to explain in a fictional setting than, reading the Book of the Law or something of that nature.
And now, see, I did not know that about the never-ending story. It's one of my favorites since being little.
Yeah, and most people don't. So, like, the talisman that Atreyu wears, the Auryn, on the back, it says, do what you wish. Like, that's a straight-up do what thou wilt reference.
Yeah, so now I'm going to have to go back and, research all those 80s favorites now.
Yeah.
It's also, fantastic, too, because now we have all the information available. And so going down these rabbit holes of research is so much more productive than it used to be.
Right.
Because I know, when I was younger, getting a hold of, Crowley's books and stuff was really difficult.
Oh, yeah, not at all anymore.
No, it's so, I've got so many of them now. As ebooks, on various devices, and it's so much more handy, and you can really just dive into them. And in your For Puck's Sake, you have so much research on so many things, and you draw a thread between different pieces of writing and research that's really, really handy. And talking about topics that are really relevant to the community. I know another article that you wrote that is a favorite of mine is Our Problematic Occult Ancestors.
Yes.
And that's a whole hornet's nest right there.
Right.
So the stuff that you talk about is really, really relevant, and it's really up to date. And I think a lot of things that an issue that a lot of other modern writers get stuck in is that they're still kind of stuck in this whole 90s era witchcraft, where Wicca is still the new greatest thing, and we're not acknowledging the work that Crowley did at all, and we're not going back to Gerald Gardner's roots. We're not going back further in the history at all. It's still kind of rehashing that 90s era Llewellyn stuff.
Right.
And so seeing the references that you make both to more historical information and making metaphors based on more modern media is really, really nice.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. But yeah, just so seeing the way that you're able to draw the thread through what's happening now to what happened in history, and the fact that everything has a reference. So I did go through your bibliography.
Yeah.
It's really, really handy. Because I'm one of those people that, if I read something and I'm like, that doesn't sound right, I will look it up. And I'm like, I got to see where that's referenced.
All right.
And I've done that in the past with books where I, looked up the references and I've been like, yeah, that person's actually been completely discredited.
Mm,
And then, you know, as we just discussed, then you gotta like keep your mouth shut and just not review the book.
right. Well,
It's all very awkward.
a lot of it is just giving credit where credit is due. And the other thing is, so one of the traps that a lot of the 90s authors put themselves into is they would say things that they learned or they got somewhere else and not credit it. And then later, that's the thing they're criticized the most because that idea was wrong, that history is wrong. And now they're seen as a source perpetuating it instead of, you know, it's easier to go back and be like, oh, well, this is what was taught in this book when I wrote the book.
There was an era in the occult and New Age and witchy community where acknowledging your sources wasn't, like when we were taught things, we would learn them, then we would forget where we learned them from.
Right. Or we would pretend our grandma told us.
Yeah, there was a lot of that too.
Yeah.
But it was just there. But there was also a lot of like, you know, everyone knows this. It's a known thing, and so then it doesn't have to be cited. But only to find out later that a lot of it was fiction that had just been made up and passed around.
Right.
And that's awkward and embarrassing. So, yeah. So, but I really like seeing those references because you're still seeing some of that happening today with people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do like to see that because it does lend a lot of veracity to stuff. And also it gives me a place to go if I want to read more about something.
Well, yeah, exactly. So, like, there's some exercises where, you know, I'm like, hey, I learned this with Laurie Cabot. I learned another version from Christopher Penczak. This is how I do it. And one of the reasons I do that is not just, you know, the citing of the source, but so people can go and look up how they do it. Because maybe their method works better for them than my method.
It absolutely worked for me because I know I've had Christopher Penczak on my to-buy list for a while now, and now I'm like, all right, I guess I finally have to actually do that.
Oh, I love him. I love his work. Yeah.
You did cite him a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, he is a main reason this book exists. So I think in my dedication, I dedicate it to 4 different peoples. One is him, and I write that this book is sort of a love letter to his book, Inner Temple of Witchcraft. And one of the things I was worried about was he was like the first person to read my book, and I was like, is this too much like your book? And he said you know, there's obviously some foundational things that, yes, you know, just like any foundational thing, it's going to be in different books, but that he feels is completely unique. One of the highest compliments he gave me was he feels that Psychic Witch is to Inner Temple as Inner Temple is to Power the Witch, which I was saying was the ancestor of this book, like, because Laurie Cabot was one of his original teachers. So for me, that's a huge compliment because while Power the Witch is a classic and a fantastic book, like, I think Inner Temple explores it a little bit deeper and differently.
Yeah, and not to poo-poo on Laurie Cabot at all because she's one of the, I don't know what, like, founders of the modern witchcraft movement for mothers, I want to say.
Right.
You know, like, not to poo-poo her work at all because she is definitely a must-read as well.
I get the privilege of, I read at her shop in October. So, like, I've known Laurie for 5 years now, and, like, she knows her shit. Like, she, you know, she's legit. She's real. Like, she is so insanely psychic, and she is so insanely magical, too. And it's great because, you know, there's a lot of people you meet that, you know, you have this idea of them, and then when it comes to them actually doing the thing, they don't really live up to...
Yeah, I totally get that. I've met a lot of those.
Yes, but Laurie is one of those people. Christopher is another one of those people. I tend to study with people that I feel are legit and are real and that I gain something from. There's been several teachers that I started to study with and just stopped just because it wasn't my thing. It wasn't vibing. And I think that's part of the discovery, part of the journey of finding what works for us.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people fall into that trap, especially with online courses and classes where they'll sign up for something because it has a great sales pitch, and then they'll try to force themselves to go through it.
Right.
Even though it might even just be a personality conflict.
Based on when this is coming out. So next year I have a bunch of different festivals and stuff. I'm speaking at different festivals all across the United States. It's a lot easier if you just go to my website or my Facebook and kind of keep up to date with what I'm doing where, because it's a lot. So matauryn.com. I'm writing my second book right now. That's in the work, but I'm not really talking a whole bunch about it. I've announced that, I got the contract for the book, and Silver Raven Wolf is honoring me by writing the foreword, which I'm fangirling about.
That's really, really exciting.
Yeah.
She doesn't do a whole lot of that stuff either.
No. To my understanding, this is the very first foreword she's written for anyone. So it's like an even huger honor, because I remember writing her letters when I was a child that were never responded to, which I can imagine she had thousands. But
oh, how cute is that, though?
Yeah. Yeah, because like in the Llewellyn books, it says to write to the author, and then so I did. I wrote to the author. Yeah, so it's cool because she was the very first. Past the craft, she was the first book I read. She was my gateway into actually doing the stuff. So it's cool to have it come full circle and have her validate my work and honor me with that foreword.
That's incredibly huge. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything else you want to mention where people should be following you? We have For Puck's Sake on Patheos. I know you're super active on Twitter and Instagram.
Yes.
You like people there?
Yes. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I'm all over the internet. Goodreads. Feel free to stalk me online because I love interacting with people and sharing things and just connecting.
And then the book will be out in
February 8th. Yes, it's an Aquarius, and it's born on the full moon of Leo.
Oh, it's going to be an Aquarius too. That sounds about right.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was pretty appropriate.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. This is going to be a great book, and I know people are going to be talking about it like crazy.
Thank you so much. It was great to be on.
Thank you for listening to the We Witches 3 podcast. For show notes and links, please go to www.wewitches3.com.